Hello, how's everyone doing? I hope everyone is doing well. Are we live? Oo, mukhang live na tayo, no? We're good to go. We're up and live. Now we may start. I'm so excited today because we are going to start talking about psychology. This is lesson number 1. We will talk about the basics of psychology. Syempre, before we dig deeper into the field of psychology, it's first very important for us to talk about the basics of the field that we are trying to study. Ang tanong, paano ba yon? Ano bang ibig sabihin natin ng salitang basic? When we hear the word basic, basically we talk about the most important things and the simplest things that we need to know about something. Diba? Yan yung ibig sabihin ng salitang basic. No, yung mga bagay na importante at pinakasimple na dapat nating malaman. And in the context of our lesson today, we will talk about 2 questions. What is psychology? Ano bang definition ng psychology? What does it involve to study psychology? And number 2, what do psychologists do? So for number 1, we will talk about psychology as a field. And number 2, we will talk about psychology as a function. Ano ba yung mga pwede nating magawa kung tayo ay nag-aaral ng psychology? Okay? So those are the 2 questions we will answer for today. Let's go directly to number 1. Exactly what do we mean by psychology? Kapag nagtanong sa'yo yung kamag-anak mo, anong course mo? Sagot mo psychology. Tapos tinanong sa'yo, ano bang pinag-aaralan sa psychology? Ang pinakamabilis na sagot dyan is, kami po ay nag-aaral tungkol sa psyche or sa mind ng tao. So that's the first 2 words that you need to say to that person, no? I study about the psyche or the mind of a person. So the word psyche here, which is equivalent to the word mind, is derived from this one, psychology. Diba? Yung psych doon sa psychology, it means psyche, which also means the mind. Actually, mahaba pa yung history niya, no? Kung anong ibig sabihin ng psyche. In some writings, for example, psyche is also equivalent to the words spirit or soul. Pero for the sake of our discussion today in this lesson, we consider psychology we just stay within the word psyche and the mind when we talk about psychology. Okay? Now, another interesting thing about psychology, so again, it's a field where we talk about the mind or the psyche of a person. Alam nyo ba na ang psyche at ang mind ng tao, it is mentioned in the Bible. Yes, at bihira yan. It is very rare for the Bible to acknowledge the presence of something that we study in a field. Okay? Nasaan ang mind o nasaan ang psyche sa Bible? We go to Matthew chapter 22 verses 37 to 38. Paano mo raw dapat mahalin ang Diyos? With all your heart, with all your soul, and guess what? With all your mind. The same thing as the word psyche. So na-mention yung salitang mind o yung salitang psyche in the Bible, which makes psychology in a way a biblical field. In-acknowledge yan sa Biblia. That's why I want you to realize this. Psychology is in the Bible, therefore we can expect a lot of psychological principles to be written in the Bible. After all, alam nyo, yung psyche, gawa naman ng Diyos yan. Who made the psyche that we study in psychology? God. So, who knows the best knowledge? Who has the best knowledge about the psyche? God Himself. Kaya alam nyo, as we go along this subject, Introduction to Psychology, you will realize and I will repeatedly show to you how amazing the Bible is in its understanding on the psyche. There are psychological ideas in the Bible centuries before scientific psychology. Ang dami ng mga research findings ngayon sa psychology na dati pang alam ng Bible, and that is centuries before scientific psychology emerged. We should not be surprised. After all, again, I keep on repeating this, the maker of the psyche is none other than God Himself. So there are a lot of psychological principles that you will see in the biblical text, and I will show you those things as we go along. Okay? Now, let's zoom into the word psyche or the mind. Alam nyo, yung psyche at yung mind natin, meron pa yung mga smaller components. Those smaller components are a person's thinking, a person's behavior, and a person's emotions. Parang cellphone, di ba? Yung cellphone natin, it's only a single entity, but it is consists of different smaller components. Power button, volume up, volume down, front camera, back camera, so on and so forth. Ganun din sa ating psyche. Yung psyche natin binubuo ng tatlo: thinking, emotions, and behavior. So given this, how do we define psychology? O ito na. Ito na talaga yung textbook definition ng psychology, no? You go to textbooks, especially if you are reading Soundtrack's textbook, he defines psychology as the scientific study of human thinking, emotions, and behaviors. Again, scientific study of human thinking, emotions, and behavior. Kaya ang implication nito, no, dito tayo dapat magaling sa tatlong bagay na yan. If you say that you are a psychology major, it means you have a mastery of those three components of the psyche. How people think, what people feel, and what people do. So yung mga tanong na itatanong sa atin ng mga tao, because we are a psych major, because we are psychologists, should have something to do with these three: thinking, emotions, and behaviors. But para mas maintindihan natin yung psychology as a field, we can divide this definition into two major categories. For example, as a psychologist, we talk about mental events. Ayan. Mental events. Sa mental events, just remember the keyword loob in Tagalog, loob, inside. Sa loob ng ating mga bungo, meron diyang utak, at yung utak na yon merong laman na mind. Okay? And there are a lot of things that are happening every moment inside that mind. We call those things mental events. Sinama na natin doon yung thinking and emotions. Okay? So yung thinking and yung emotions, they are under mental events. Nag-aaral tayo ng mga topic in psychology na may kinalaman sa mental events. Like what? Some examples of mental events would include the following: how to remember better. We talk about memory. Paano ba makakaalala ng mas maganda? Bakit marami mga tao malilimutin? Can you train yourself to have a better memory? Why do we remember some details more and some details it's very hard to remember? Is it true that you can consciously make yourself forget something or someone? Pwede mo ba talaga maturuan yung isip mo na makalimot? Pinag-aaralan yan in psychology. We talk about intelligence also in this field. O talino. Saan ba nakakabili ng talino? Saan ba nakukuha yan? Nabibili ba yan? Totoo ba na ang katalinuhan namamana? Can you still improve your intelligence? Let's say your IQ score is average. Can you make it above average? From above average, can you make yourself a genius? We talk about that in psychology. In psychology, we also talk about self-esteem. Very important that our self-esteem should be in the healthy level. Because if your self-esteem is low, kapag bagsak yung self-esteem ng tao, all the bad things happen in the person's psychological life. As in, all the bad things. That person becomes depressed, nawawalan siya ng confidence, hindi siya nakakamit ng mga tao, wala siyang healthy relationships, they develop all sorts of mental disorders. Question: if you have low self-esteem, can you further increase your self-esteem? And if yes, how? All of those questions can be answered by someone who is studying psychology. The second category in the field of psychology is we also talk about mental actions. So hindi lang tayo puro loob, tayo ay lumalabas din. Just remember the keyword labas. Hindi lang natin pinag-aaralan yung nangyayari dito sa loob ng ating mga ulo, but we also study the outward expressions or the outward behaviors of people. Okay, so psychology is a field that talks about behavioral expressions or actions. Like what? Halimbawa, in psychology, we try to answer such questions. Why do people become aggressive? Maraming ganyan, di ba? Yung konting offense lang nagagalit na at yung galit niya sobrang tindi. Nagdadrive lang siya ng kotse, o biglang merong nag-cut sa kanya na bike, uminit yung ulo niya, that's already enough for him to get his gun, go down his car, and shoot the cyclist. May mga taong ganyan, nagro-road rage, di ba? May mga napapatay na mga tao sa daan dahil sa simpleng away trapiko. Why does that even happen? We talk about that in psychology. We also talk about habits in psychology. And it's very important, 'di ba? Sabi nga nila yung habits mo that will determine whether you will be successful in life or not. Yung mangyayari sa buhay mo nakadepende yan if you have good habits or bad habits. How do you develop good habits? Paano mo ba tuturuan yung sarili mo na mag-ipon at huwag kang gastos ng gastos? Paano ba tuturuan yung sarili mo na gumising ng maaga para maging productive? Paano mo tuturuan yung sarili mo na huwag masyadong nanonood ng Netflix kasi nood ka ng nood, wala ka halos nagagawa? How do you develop good habits? And the reverse is also true. How do you undo? How do you reverse bad habits? Kasi yung mga bad habits na yan, ito talaga yung nakakabagsak sa quality ng buhay. Especially when you develop vices. Diba? Smoking became your habit. Drugs became your habit. And all the other vices, nakakabagsak talaga ng buhay ng tao yan. Question, if you are a victim of these bad habits, can you overcome them? Meron bang mga techniques na pwedeng gawin para ma-overcome mo yung mga bad habits na yan? We talk about that in psychology. And of course, in psychology, in connection to behaviors, no, we also talk about this one. How to correctly parent a child. 'Di ba? What is the right way to discipline a child? Kailangan ba ang bata sinisigawan? Dapat ba ang bata laging binibigyan ng parusa, gina-grounded? Okay lang ba i-grounded yung bata? Okay lang ba na pagbawalan siya na maglaro ng online games? Kasi bumabagsak yung grade niya? Okay lang ba sigaw-sigawan siya? We talk about that. What if your child is bullied? Ano dapat gagawin kapag yung anak mo na bully? Ano bang dapat mong response? Sino ang dapat mong kakausapin? Should you talk to the bully? Should you go to the school? Should you talk to the teacher? Should you talk to your child first? All these things na sinasabi ko are all being answered in the field of psychology. Okay? So I hope you are learning so far. Nakikilala nyo kung ano yung ibig sabihin ng psychology. It's all about mental events and outward actions. We try to study why are those things happening. Now, let's go back to the definition of psychology. There is a very important word that we should not forget, no? And that is the word scientific. Huwag yung kakalimutan yung salitang scientific in the definition of psychology. What is psychology? The scientific study of human thinking and behavior. That word scientific right here, that is very, 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 very important. So don't you forget that word. Okay? Pero, let's dig deeper. So, psychology is the scientific study of human thinking and behavior. So, that means, ang isa lang ang ibig sabihin yan, that means, psychology is a science. Diba? If we are going to attach the word scientific in psychology, then it makes it a science. Diba? So, ang magic tanong ngayon, the magic question now is, what do you mean exactly when you say that psychology is a science? Good question. Psychology is a science, so what does it mean to be a science? Actually, the answer to that question has something to do with the way we answer questions. Remember, in the field of psychology, we are being asked questions. Questions about what? Balikan natin yung natutunan natin kanina about thinking, emotions, and behavior. Questions about mental events and human actions. Some examples of these questions that we are expected to answer. O, bakit niya ako iniwan? Alam mo na ba, ba't kanya iniwan? O, paano ba makamove on? Alam mo ba yung sagot dyan? How can I study better? How can I control my anger? Lahat na lang kasi minumura mo. How do I deal with stress? Konting bagay, nai-stress ka, kaya ka laging bumabagsak sa exam. Diba? How can I communicate better with my parents? Hindi mo na sila magets minsan. Oh, marami kang mga gustong sabihin, hindi mo masabi because you don't know the right way on how to tell them. All these questions are being asked to us because we study psychology. Now, going back to our issue, so what does it mean when we say that psychology is a science? It means, kapag sinasagot natin yung mga tanong na yan, gumagamit tayo ng scientific method. Let me repeat. Psychology is a science because it answers its questions, its psychological questions using what we call the scientific method. Very important. Because remember, psychology is a science, then we should use the scientific method. Do you still remember the steps of the scientific method? Diba? High school pa lang, paulit-ulit na yung mga steps na yan, diba? What is the way of science? The following. Bago ka sumagot ng tanong, mag-undergo ka ng process na yan. You start with observation, then problem identification, you hypothesize, you gather data, you analyze the results, and then that's the only time that you can answer that question through your conclusion. Ganyan kadami yung steps na sinusunod ng mga scientists, and that includes psychologists. That's the way we should answer psychological questions. We need to undergo the scientific process. Bakit? Ulitin ko, because psychology is a science. Very important. Kaya nga, alam nyo, another implication of this, if psychology is a science and it uses the scientific method in trying to answer questions about mental events and behaviors, alam nyo, that's the reason why you will have a lot of research subjects. Because psychology is all about research, scientific research. Ano ba yung mga subjects na yan na may kinalaman sa research? Ayan, no? Look forward to taking psychological statistics, psychological research, thesis writing. Kaya hindi totoo na walang math sa psychology. O, diba? Laging common na sagot yan. Bakit ka nag-psychology? Kasi walang math dyan. Hindi totoo yan. In psychology, we teach you psychological statistics 1 and 2. Oh, merong maraming math sa psychology. Diba? Bakit ba tayo dapat nag-i-statistics sa psychology? Bakit ba tayo dapat nagsa-psychological research? Because that's the essence of being a psychologist. We do research to answer psychological questions. And in your program, the best way or the final way of proving to us, your teachers, that you already have the skill of being a psychologist is by writing a thesis. Kaya nga tayo may thesis writing Dito namin susukatin how good are you in answering psychological questions using the way of science. That's very important. Okay, so I hope by this point you already understand why psychology is a science. Again, uulitin ko para hindi nyo malimutan, it is a science because it uses scientific method in answering psychological questions. So this means, if we answer psychological questions this way, ang ibig sabihin yan, lahat ng sinasabi natin in the field of psychology, lahat, as in all psychological conclusions, all psychological statements, like for example, when you say married men are generally happier than single men, when you say children from broken families are more prone to depression, where did this come from? Gawa-gawa lang natin? No. All the statements that we say about the human mind, about the human psyche, is the product of the scientific method. Hindi tayo magsasabi ng mga bagay in psychology na hindi produkto ng scientific method. That's very important because that is our identity. If you are a psychologist, you are a scientist, you answer questions the scientific way, and that means you undergo the scientific method before you make any conclusion. Yan ang ibig sabihin ng pagiging psych major. So the bottom line here is, another implication na dapat yung matutunan is, in psychology, data, we first analyze the data before we make any conclusions. Okay? Hindi tayo pwedeng magsabi ng isang psychological statement without data. That should not be. All psychological statements that you claim to be true, that you report, that you share with other people, must be supported by scientific data. Yan ang pinagkaiba natin sa mga chismosa. Diba? There is a big difference between those people on the streets talking about psychological things and scientific psychology. Itong mga chismosa na ito, when they talk about things, most of the time wala naman silang basis eh. They just say what they want to say because it feels good to say it, because they feel it's true. Data is not needed. Basta interesting yung sinasabi mo, okay yan. But that's not the way of a psychologist. Ang psychologist, ang dami nating alam about human behavior, about human thinking, but all those things that we know, it comes from somewhere. It comes from the rigorous method of scientific research. Kaya alam nyo, I want to warn everyone listening to me right now, beware of those internet wisdom claiming to be coming from psychology. Lalong-lalo na yung psychology says na yan, nakakapang-init ng ulo yung ibang mga statements dyan sa psychology says na yan. Right? Like for example, if you read these kinds of things, psychology says this, psychology says that, beware of this. Your reaction to this post must be with skepticism. Although it sounds good, it sounds inspiring, but it doesn't mean it's true. Now, I'm not saying all of these things are false, but what I'm saying here is, if we are to believe this, if we claim this to be true, kailangan na hanapan mo muna ng data. So that's always what you look for whenever you encounter words like this, claiming to be coming from psychology. Do you have the data? Do you have the data to support this quote? If the answer is no, walang data yung ano na yan, yung saying na yan, then it's not enough for you to believe these words. The saying, the quote does not qualify to be a psychological truth within scientific psychology. Dapat ma-educate yung mga tao dyan. Kasi marami yung mga tao, especially lay people, whenever they see this post, they believe. Kasi nakita nila yung word na psychology. Psychology says. But you have to be skeptical. Okay, if psychology said this, show me where the data is. Kung walang data, it's not yet considered true. We are not saying it's false. Show us the data, then it becomes true. No data, then let's not label these words as true until we have the data to support that these things are indeed true. Okay? So, yan yung tinatawag nating may tawag dyan, no? Ang tawag dyan is the scientific attitude. Hindi tayo naniniwala sa isang truth hanggat wala tayong nakikitang concrete data to show na totoo nga yung sinasabi ng mga quotes na yan. Now, another common question that students ask about psychology is, can psychologists read minds? Diba? Very common yan, no? Sa mga parties, o nagtatanungan ng mga careers, diba? Oh, what do you do? When you say, oh, I'm a psychologist, ano ka agad yung gagawin? Oh, talaga, psychologist nga? Sige nga, basahin mo nga yung iniisip ko. Yun ba ay legitimate, yung ganong request? Dahil yung kausap mo, psychologist, magpapabasa ka ng utak mo? Well, let's settle this down. Can psychologists really read minds? The answer is yes. We can read minds, but we have a different approach in how we read minds. In scientific psychology, the way we read minds is, again, we always go back to the data. We always go back to the data. And where do we get this data? By observation, by giving them psychological tests, which you will learn in your program. Meron kayong subject dyan on psychological testing 1 and 2, or you interview them. So we collect all this data about the person, and then what do? We try to analyze the data, and then from there, we can read your mind. Diba? So nauna muna yung, again, what's the word? The big letter D, nauna muna yung data bago natin binasa yung utak ng tao. That is what makes us different from fortune tellers. Diba yung mga fortune tellers, nakakahula yan ng outcome? Oh. Pero ang mga fortune tellers naman kasi, they are not using data to support their predictions. Usually, they use the aura, they use the vibrations, they use spiritual energies to say something about the person. We are not like that. And don't be like that. Wag mong tatawagin yung sarili mo na psychologist ka, and yet, kung magbasa ka ng tao, para kang manghuhula. Okay? That should not be. Another thing about psychology is, it is a very legitimate field that it has professional organizations. Like for example, in the Philippines, we have Psychological Association of the Philippines. Ito yon. Psychological Association of the Philippines. Kapag professional psychologist na kayo, after you graduate, you can be a member of this. Although meron ding PAPJA. PAPJA is Psychological Association of the Philippines Junior Affiliates. Yung mga students ng psychology pwedeng maging member ng PAPJA. Okay? And also we have, ito international to, the American Psychological Association. That's international. PAP is local. Ang tanong, ano ba ang silbi? What is the purpose of these professional organizations in psychology? Well, they are very important because, number one, ito yung mga ginagawa nila, no? They are the ones organizing conventions. Yearly conventions where different psychologists in different parts of the Philippines, they meet in one place and then they will present their researches about the human mind. So, pagsasama-samahin yung mga researches, and then they will be critiquing each other, they will be suggesting new topics to talk about to make the field grow. Ganun kasi nag-grow ang isang field, no? By asking more questions. Answering questions and then answering questions and then coming up with new questions. Nangyayari yan sa isang convention. Although ngayon, hindi nagkaroon ng physical meeting because it's the pandemic, nagkaroon naman ng virtual convention ang PAP. Another function of these organizations is, they also regulate publications of scientific papers na may kinalaman sa psychology. So speaking of scientific papers, kung nakakita na kayo ng isang psychology journal article, and I think you should see this, ayan. These are some examples of journal articles within the field of psychology. Dapat maging familiar na kayo sa term na journal articles, because in this program, you will be asked to read a lot of journal articles. Again, journal articles like this. Legitimate journal articles. Kasi may mga journal articles na peke, no? Oo. Anyway, we will teach you how would you know if a journal article is legit or not. But the following that you can see, itong mga journal articles na ito ay legit. And just to mention, alam nyo ba itong author na ito, si Miss Caridad Taroja, is one of our faculty members. Yes. Here in our department, she is an expert in the field of psychological testing and assessment. So in the future, mamimit nyo siya, especially when you take assessment subjects, no? Very interesting. Very good teacher. Okay, what else? Oh, ito pa pala, ipa-plug ko to, no? This is very important. This is my publication yan. Sumulat din ako ng journal article. Although hindi lang ako mag-isa, no? Marami kami diyan. But look at that name. That's my name. There you go. That's my name. So this article, we work together as a team to talk about, ano nga ba yung topic namin dito? Yeah, ito. We talk about the psyche of people who are working students? Ano ba yung mga common experiences ng mga taong working students? How do they look at work? How do they cope with their difficulties of being working students? Yan yung pinag-aralan namin in that journal article. Alright? So, more journal articles to come as you go along this program. And then, another thing you have to know about psychology is you need a license to practice psychology, ha? Hindi lang basta-basta nagbibigay ka ng psychological test, nagka-counseling ka, nagte-telepsychology ka. You need first to secure a license before you can practice psychology. But before you get the license, you need to undergo or you need to pass the board exam. Yes, that's right. Meron pong board exam ang psychology. Actually, dalawang klase yan. No? Merong psychologist, merong psychometrician. Psychometrician, you specialize in giving out psychological tests, using psychological tests, interpreting psychological tests, while being a psychologist, yung lisensya ng psychologist gives you the power to run therapy, psychological therapy, psychotherapies. But they work together, no? Psychologists and psychometricians, they work together as a team. Okay, maliwanag ba yan? And I really hope this will be one of your goals in your field, ha? After you graduate, you review for the board exam, and then you take the board exam, and then you get that license, either as a psychologist or as a psychometrician or both. One more thing, very important, and this is also a very common question, magkaiba po ang psychologist sa psychiatrist. Many students ask that. What's the difference? Well, the basic difference between the two is, para lang mas simple intindihin, no? Psychologists deal with the software while psychiatrists deal with the hardware. And what do you mean by the hardware? When we talk about the hardware, ibig sabihin yan, psychiatrist is very biological. The body. They talk about the brain, hormones, and the nervous system. Ano ba yung mga role nun in understanding the psyche? That's a psychiatrist. While psychologists naman, when we talk about software, ang pinag-aaralan natin dito is the mind. Ang psychiatrist kasi, ang primary focus niyan is the brain. Iba yun, ha? Mind is the software. It's non-physical, while brain is physical, including the nervous system. So, ang focus ng psychiatrist, yung physical dimension, while the focus of a psychologist is the non-physical dimension. Kaya nga, another important distinction between psychologists and psychiatrists is, psychologists are not medical doctors. Hindi tayo doktor. We are not. While psychiatrists are medical doctors. Kaya yung mga psychiatrists, pwede mo silang lagyan ng MD sa end of their names. But psychologists, you don't have an MD, rather you have a PhD. If you will be a legitimate psychologist. Diba? You have a PhD. So, iba yon. Maliwanag ba? Oo. And then, just to further illustrate how psychologists and psychiatrists are different, let's take for example, how would they deal with someone who is depressed? Iba sila ng approach kasi iba sila ng orientation, di ba? So yung psychologist, paano niya gagamutin ang isang taong depressed? The following are some of the things that a psychologist will ask a depressed person to do. Ayan, oh. Describe to me how you relate with your parents. Take the psychological test. Watch a happy movie or listen to a happy song to improve your moods. Diba? Walang gamot na ginamit because again, we are dealing with the software of the person. Sa kabila naman, the psychiatrists, because they are medical doctors, their approach will be very physiological. Buy these meds for you to sleep better. Siguro antidepressants yan. Undergo a blood test, X-ray or MRI to check certain parts of the brain. Do you have a family history of being depressed? Because depression, according to the literature, it's highly genetics. Diba? So, magkaiba sila ng approach. That's why psychologists cannot prescribe medicines. Psychiatrists can. Diba? So tayong mga psychologists, psych majors, wala tayong karapatan to prescribe medicine, pero kayang gawin yan ng mga psychiatrist. Now, don't have this picture na magkalaban yung psychologists versus mga psychiatrists. No, they're not. In fact, they work together. They should work together. Diba? If you are going to deal effectively with a person, you really need to have a mastery of both the hardware and the software. Kasi magkaano naman yan eh. Magka-connect naman yan, dalawang yan eh. Diba yung hardware at saka yung software, they're connected. They are not separated. So a lot of psychologists work hand in hand with psychiatrists. Okay? So they are not opposing fields. They are very much related fields. One more thing before I move on to the last slide. Anong difference ng AB psychology sa BS psychology, no? AB psychology is more on pre-law. It's a pre-law subject. Meaning, if you are going to take up law in the future, pwede mong gamitin yung pagka-AB psychology mo to take up law. Kasi 'di ba required yung 4-year course before you take up the law proper, no? AB psychology is pre-law, while BS psychology is pre-med. So karamihan ng mga nagbi-BS psychology, ang career path talaga nila is papunta sa medical field. Kasi before you can take a medical field, before you can take NMAT, dapat graduate ka ng 'di ba? Ng 4-year course na pre-med, and that's Bachelor of Science in Psychology. Okay? So, yan yung mga basic things that you need to know about psychology. So, in summary, before we go, ito yung mga, para hindi nyo malimutan the most important things that you should have learned today is number 1, again, what is psychology? It is a field of knowledge. It is a scientific field. In this field, we talk about the psyche or the mind. The psyche or the mind can be divided into 2 categories. We talk about mental events, mga bagay na nangyayari sa loob ng ating pag-iisip. That includes thinking issues, emotional issues, and we also talk about actions or behaviors that people do outside. So I want to leave you with some of these closing questions. Very important, no? Closing questions tayo. Is psychology what you really want? Okay, as I discussed, in connection to everything I have discussed so far, yan ba talaga ang gusto mo? Remember, 3 to 4 years ang itatagal mo dito sa program. So you really have to make sure if these are the things that you are interested about. Thinking, feeling, actions. Mental events, human behaviors. Are you interested with these things? Number 2, mas importante ito, do you see yourself studying psychology? Diba nai-imagine mo ba yung sarili mo na yung mga binabasa mong article, yung mga binabasa mong textbook tungkol sa mga bagay na yon? Does it interest you? That's another good question to ask. And of course, number 3, do you see yourself practicing psychology in the future? Pag magpa-practice ka na, yan ba talaga yung gusto mong gawin? People will ask you psychological questions. You will be dealing with mental disorders. You will be dealing with behavioral issues. Those are the questions that you really need to ask yourself as you continue your stay here in this program. Okay, so if you have any other questions about our lesson for today, don't hesitate to post a question in the description box below or email me if you want, and I'm going to do my best to answer those questions. Alright? So, I hope you learned something from our lesson today. Marami tayong natutunan. Very important, very interesting talaga yung field of psychology. And think about this. Kung talagang ito ba yung talagang gusto nyong field na gagawin. Okay? So I'm going to see you I'm going to see you in the future for our next lesson. Thank you for listening. Have a great day and God bless. Bye-bye.